So Carney rejected the deadline, and 72 hours later, Washington discovered that pressure only works when the other side still needs what you are threatening to withhold. Not a tactical misunderstanding, not a temporary diplomatic chill, not one of those performative disputes that gets inflated for television and quietly resolved before the paperwork even matters. This was something much more expensive than that. It was a full exposure of leverage that looked powerful on camera and weak on contact. Because what happened over those next 3 days was not just a disagreement between Ottawa and Washington, it was a repricing of assumptions. The assumption that size automatically creates control. The assumption that access to the American market can always force timing on an ally. The assumption that if Washington sets a deadline loudly enough, everybody else will organize their economy around American political needs. That assumption was tested, and it failed. The market saw it before most headlines did. Currency desks saw it in the opening rotation. Transport analysts saw it in the way cross-border logistics names stopped trading like a hostage to escalation and started trading like a system preparing for rerouting, not collapse. Procurement teams saw it in supplier calls that suddenly changed in tone. What looked at first like a dangerous standoff began to look like something else entirely. One side had arrived with a threat, the other side had arrived with a map. And that is the whole story here. Washington brought pressure. Carney brought preparation. Pressure feels stronger in the room. Preparation wins after the room empties. Hit subscribe because what happens next is the part most people miss. The refusal itself is dramatic, but the real story is what refusal means after the documents move, after industries adjust, and after politicians realize that the threat they planned their messaging around no longer produces the obedience they expected. The next phase is where this stops being a negotiation story and becomes a structural one. Your 401k is already paying for this trade war, whether television is honest about that or not. Every repriced input, every delayed shipment, every hedged currency position, every company forced to build cost into the next quarter instead of confidence into the next year. All of that eventually lands in retirement accounts, household budgets, and the slow erosion of purchasing power. And according to me, it is only going to get more expensive from here because once markets decide a political threat is operationally hollow, the cost does not disappear. It migrates, it spreads, it compounds. Now, before I continue, I want to quickly mention something that I think every American over 50 needs to see right now. Everything we have been covering, the tariffs, the inflation pressure, the retirement risk, the damage that political volatility can do to fixed income planning, I have pulled into a complete guide called the Buffett Blueprint. It applies Warren Buffett's core principles to the exact kind of economic instability this trade war creates. Your 401k, your Social Security planning, your cash reserves, your dividend exposure, all of it is addressed with a practical protection framework you can start using this week. The link is right below this video. It is called the Buffett Blueprint. Check it out. Let me walk you through the full context, because if you only watch the public statements, this entire episode looks simpler than it was. Publicly, this was framed as a familiar confrontation. Washington demanded movement, attached urgency to its demands, implied consequences for delay, and expected Ottawa to read the imbalance of size as a reason to comply. That is the old playbook. The old assumption is that Canada, by geography and exposure, must eventually bend because the American market is simply too large to defy for too long. But that assumption only works if the smaller party is strategically static. It only works if the smaller party is waiting to be acted upon, and that was the first major American misread. Carney's team was not static. They were not improvising. They were not trying to win the argument in public before they solved the arithmetic in private. They were doing the opposite. They were reducing vulnerability before the confrontation reached its loudest phase. That matters, because most trade conflicts are misunderstood as battles of language when they are really battles of timing and substitution. The side that can replace faster, reroute faster, absorb politically faster, and hold uncertainty longer is often the side with the real leverage, even if it is smaller on paper. A tariff threat sounds absolute until somebody proves that the threatened dependency is smaller, slower, or more reversible than you thought. What Carney understood, and what Washington seemed slow to internalize, is that leverage is not a slogan. Leverage is a ratio. It is not enough to say, we are bigger. Bigger is not the same thing as indispensable. Bigger is not the same thing as irreplaceable. Bigger is not even the same thing as patient. If the bigger party is under a tighter political clock, a more fragile media cycle, a more immediate business backlash, and a more visible inflation sensitivity, then size can become a burden instead of an advantage. And that is exactly where this dispute moved. The first stage happened quietly. Before the deadline ever became a public spectacle, Ottawa had already started doing the work that makes refusal credible. Industry consultations were tightened. Exposure mapping was refined. Officials were no longer just asking which sectors would be hit hardest by tariffs. They were asking which sectors in the United States would scream first, which governors would call first, which import-dependent districts would begin lobbying for carve-outs first, and which supply bottlenecks would move from theory to pain fastest. That is a different level of preparation. That is not moral outrage. That is systems analysis. And once you start viewing the conflict that way, the Carney move stops looking emotional and starts looking almost clinical. Washington wanted compliance on its timeline. Ottawa asked a harder question. What actually happens if we do not comply on theirs? That question opened up several uncomfortable answers for the American side. First, some of the sectors Washington treated as pressure points were also domestic political vulnerabilities. Second, the U.S. business community, especially manufacturers with integrated North American exposure, did not want a drawn-out symbolism contest. They wanted predictability. Third, a tariff or trade threat is only effective if businesses believe it will remain coherent long enough to alter behavior. But if the threat collides with election season messaging, inflation, anxiety, and pressure from affected states, coherence degrades fast. So when the deadline arrived, Carney did not react as if the clock itself was power. He treated it as theater unless backed by durable arithmetic. That is the part people miss. A deadline without durable arithmetic is a calendar event. It is not leverage. And when he refused, the refusal carried force because it was not naked defiance. It was supported defiance. It was a refusal sitting on top of consultations, fallback planning, sectoral modeling, political mapping, and alternative pathways that had already been explored enough to reduce panic. He was not saying no into a vacuum. He was saying no with a structure behind him. This is where the American side appears to have overestimated the psychological effect of urgency. There is a long-standing habit in large power negotiating culture of assuming that compression favors the larger party. Set the meeting, set the terms, set the countdown. Force the smaller side to live inside your rhythm. That can work when the smaller side is fragmented, politically exposed, and informationally weaker. It does not work as well when the smaller side has already spent weeks identifying the difference between symbolic pain and actual pain. Carney's advantage, in my view, was not that Canada suddenly became immune to American pressure. That would be absurd. The advantage was narrower and more important. Canada became informed enough to distinguish between the pressure that would make headlines and the pressure that would actually hold. And those are not the same thing. Headlines are fast, costs are slower, politics is noisy, supply chains are quieter but more durable. Washington was speaking in headlines, Ottawa was answering in cost curves. The reason that matters is because of how modern trade conflicts unfold. Most viewers imagine a trade war as a single confrontation. One side threatens, the other side responds, markets shake, somebody wins. In reality, the process is layered. There is the political layer, where leaders perform confidence. There is the corporate layer, where firms call lawyers, bankers, and logistics managers. There is the institutional layer, where agencies, customs systems, and compliance desks begin modeling impact. And then there is the capital layer, where investors decide whether the threat is real enough to survive contact with quarterly results. Washington seemed to believe the political layer could dominate the others. Carney behaved as if the lower layers would decide the outcome. That is why the 72 hours after the refusal were so important. Those 72 hours were the bridge between threat and verification. Everyone was waiting to see whether the refusal would trigger immediate punishment or expose hesitation. And hesitation is exactly what appeared. Not because American officials lacked volume. They had volume. Not because they lacked indignation. They had plenty of that. What they lacked was frictionless follow-through. Every trade threat has a hidden question underneath it. How much domestic pain are you truly willing to absorb to prove a point? And the answer is almost always lower than politicians imply. The larger the economy, the more actors there are to object. Importers object, exporters object, governors object, union stakeholders object, retailers object, pension-sensitive investors object. The television version of power is concentrated. The operational version of power is negotiated every hour by people who have to survive the consequences of using it. Carney seems to have understood that Washington's coalition for escalation was broader in rhetoric than in endurance. Now, one of the most interesting features of this entire episode is that the apparent strength of the American position rested on a very old mental shortcut. Dependence equals obedience. That shortcut can survive for years until one side starts building enough optionality to disobey selectively. You do not need total independence to weaken leverage. You just need enough alternatives, enough sequencing, and enough tolerance for transition cost to stop immediate coercion from working on command. That is why information advantage mattered so much here. When I say information advantage, I do not mean some cinematic secret memo. I mean something more important and more realistic. I mean knowing your own exposures better than the other side knows your exposures. I mean understanding which industries can adapt in 6 weeks and which need 6 months. I mean knowing which pain points will trigger media panic and which will barely register beyond specialist desks. I mean knowing with discipline the difference between a scary threat and an unmanageable one. That knowledge changes behavior. It lets a government absorb the opening shock without confusing it for the final outcome. There is also a political discipline element here that deserves attention. For a refusal like this to work, the domestic front must remain coordinated long enough to deny the larger party a soft point of entry. If provinces, sector groups, or major firms begin freelancing publicly, the pressure campaign regains traction. But if the message is steady, not reckless, not theatrical, simply steady, then the larger party begins to see something it does not like. Time is not compounding in its favor, and when time stops compounding in your favor, leverage decays. This is where the style of Carney's approach matters. He is not a politician whose core strength is public combustion. He does not rely on emotional escalation to manufacture authority. His public style tends to project control through calm, through process, through technical command. In a trade standoff, that matters more than people think. Calm communicates preparation. Calm tells markets that the refusal was probably priced internally before it was expressed externally. Calm tells counterparts that panic is not available as a negotiating instrument. Washington, by contrast, often benefits politically from confrontation as spectacle. The problem is that spectacle burns fastest when there is no immediate submission to validate it. If you build a public event around compellence and the target does not comply, you have to choose quickly between escalation and reinterpretation. Escalation carries domestic cost. Reinterpretation carries reputational cost. That is a bad fork to face under media pressure. And that, more than anything, is what the 72 hours exposed. The fork appeared. Washington had to decide whether to bear the real cost of its posture or begin adjusting the story around it. The adjustment did not have to be announced as surrender to function like one. This is another crucial point. Great powers rarely say, "We were wrong, our leverage failed." What they do instead is revise emphasis. They blur sequencing. They elevate process. They talk about productive dialogue, ongoing review, constructive engagement, technical consultations, the need for stability, the value of partnership. In other words, they move linguistically from compulsion to management. And when that shift happens immediately after a refused deadline, markets understand the translation even if television does not. The translation is simple. The threat has encountered limits. Let me go deeper into the mechanics because this is where Buffett's framework becomes incredibly useful. Buffett has always had a way of stripping noisy events down to their cash logic. He asks basic questions with ruthless discipline. Who needs whom more? What happens if the arrangement stops? Who can survive the interruption longer? Which side is pretending a short-term political win is equal to a long-term structural advantage? Those questions are not glamorous, but they are devastatingly clarifying. In this case, the key question is not whether the United States is larger than Canada. Of course it is. The real question is whether the relevant forms of dependency were symmetrical enough to make compellence costly, and the answer increasingly looks like yes. Consider the architecture of a deeply integrated continental economy. It is not a one-lane road where one side simply blocks access and walks away. It is a mesh of contracts, inputs, energy flows, intermediate goods, industrial planning assumptions, and synchronized investment timelines. Break one line, and you often stress 5 others. Impose uncertainty in one sector, and you can create price effects in another. Threaten a partner, and you can end up repricing your own domestic planning cycle. That is why blunt pressure becomes less efficient over time in mature integrated systems. The more connected the platform, the harder it is to deliver one-directional pain. So Carney's refusal was not just diplomatic, it was diagnostic. It tested whether Washington still possessed cheap leverage. The results suggest that leverage exists, but not cheaply. And the difference between leverage and cheap leverage is enormous. Cheap leverage can be used often. Expensive leverage gets threatened more than used. If that sounds abstract, bring it back to households. When pressure is cheap, policymakers use it freely because the blowback is limited. When pressure is expensive, even a technically stronger actor becomes cautious because every additional turn of the screw can hit consumers, employers, donors, unions, governors, markets, and inflation expectations at once. Suddenly, what looked like a show of strength becomes a multi-front management problem, and markets hate management problems disguised as strategic clarity. Another part of the story that deserves attention is the psychological asymmetry between the two sides. Canada needed to prove that it would not move simply because Washington expected movement. The United States needed to prove that its public pressure still converted into concessions. Those are very different burdens. Canada's burden was binary, hold or fold. Washington's burden was performative and practical at the same time. Project control, maintain domestic coalition discipline, avoid inflation shock, protect sensitive sectors, and extract visible compliance. That is a heavier burden than people assume. A lot of large powers lose bargaining efficiency because they mistake intimidation for simplicity. The threat looks simple at the podium. It becomes complicated the second you need to implement it without harming yourself more than your target. And all of this happened against a broader backdrop that made Washington even less comfortable with prolonged uncertainty. Investors are already sensitive to policy volatility. Households are sensitive to cost creep. Executives are sensitive to capital expenditure timing. If you overlay a trade conflict on top of those conditions, the tolerance for symbolic escalation shrinks. You start needing clean wins, fast wins, television wins. But the stronger your need for a fast win, the weaker your bargaining position becomes if the other side knows it. That, again, is information advantage. Now let me shift into the deeper strategic layer, because the refusal itself was only the surface expression of a much larger Canadian bet. The bet was that endurance plus preparation can offset size plus urgency. The bet was that if Canada could survive the first wave without panicking, American political incentives would begin working against maximal pressure. The bet was not that Washington would suddenly become generous. The bet was that Washington would become constrained. Those are very different things. And the distinction matters because constrained power does not disappear. It becomes selective, negotiated, and more vulnerable to domestic interruption. Once a power becomes constrained in that way, the smaller counterpart gains room. Not unlimited room, but meaningful room. Room to delay, room to redirect, room to turn public confrontation into private complexity, room to let the larger side experience the difference between announcing a position and sustaining one. Now, Warren Buffett, if you think about the way he reads events, has always favored that kind of translation. He looks past words and into incentives. He does not ask who sounded toughest. He asks who ended up owning the more durable asset, the longer runway, the stronger negotiating table, the lower forced error rate. His whole career is built on distrusting noise and respecting structure. And if you apply that lens here, the story becomes brutal for Washington, because Washington may still have the larger economy, but Carney managed to force a different comparison. Not economy versus economy, decision quality versus message discipline, time horizon versus news cycle, structural preparedness versus tactical intimidation. Those are not the categories the American side wanted to be judged on. This is the point in the story where Buffett's response becomes especially sharp. Warren Buffett, who has spent nearly a century watching governments confuse volume with value, would not read this as a momentary diplomatic flap. He would read it as a pricing event in political form. He would say that when one side threatens a cost and the other side calmly studies whether the threat can actually be sustained, the outcome tells you something fundamental about both parties. It tells you who has been doing arithmetic and who has been doing theater. And I think his response, if put in the language this channel uses, would sound something like this. In 94 years, I have seen a lot of people mistake size for discipline. I have seen countries do it. I have seen companies do it. I have seen executives do it after a few easy years convince them that being bigger meant they no longer had to be precise. The market eventually corrects that kind of thinking, and it usually does it in a way that feels sudden to the people who stop doing the arithmetic. What happened here is not that the United States became weak. That would be an unserious reading. What happened is that the United States discovered a limit. There is a big difference between having power and having power that can be used without charging interest to yourself. Investors should care about that difference. Voters should care about that difference. Allies definitely care about that difference. A deadline is only persuasive if the person hearing it believes you can afford what happens after they say no. If they look at your politics, your inflation exposure, your industry lobbying, your state-level sensitivities, and your market vulnerability, and conclude that your own cost to follow through is too high, then the deadline was never the asset people thought it was. It was a test, and the test went the wrong way. The side that handled this well is the side that understood sequence. They did not have to prove they were invulnerable. Nobody is invulnerable in a trading relationship this integrated. They only had to prove that they had prepared enough to survive the first burst of pressure and watch the other side discover the true price of using its leverage. That is a very different skill, and it is often the one that matters most. People are going to focus on language, on who sounded tougher, on whether the public statements looked forceful enough. I would not. I would focus on what happens when your counterpart refuses your timetable and your system responds by softening instead of intensifying. That is the whole case in one sentence. And here is the investment translation. When power becomes expensive to use, the market begins reallocating credibility. Not overnight all at once, but gradually, then suddenly enough for everyone to pretend the signs were obvious. The credibility premium shifts away from whoever dominated the press conference and toward whoever appeared to understand the plumbing. That is what this was, a plumbing event disguised as a political one. The ones who manage these moments well are not the ones who shout hardest. They are the ones who understand where the pipes run, who controls the valves, how much pressure the joints can bear, and which side can live longer with lower flow. The ones who manage them badly are the ones who keep hitting the same valve harder because the room applauded the first time. Washington wanted a concession. What it got was information. The information is not flattering. And here is the judgment. Carney did not have to overpower Washington to weaken Washington's position. He only had to refuse at a moment when the American side was not prepared to pay full price for enforcement. That is enough. That is often more than enough. In markets and in diplomacy, it is sometimes the moment of non-compliance, not the moment of victory, that changes the whole bargaining landscape. Washington still has tools. But tools that are visibly expensive to use stop being tools and start becoming threats people discount. That discount is the story. Now let me give you the consequences, because this is where the long-term damage or long-term opportunity gets defined. The first consequence is precedent, and its reach is much larger than this one dispute. Allies, trading partners, investors, and internal political actors all study the same lesson. If Washington's deadline can be refused and then metabolized without immediate collapse, other actors will become more confident in testing American compellence in narrower domains. Not everywhere, not recklessly, but selectively, intelligently, and with greater patience than before. That matters because credibility in international economic politics is cumulative on the way up and cumulative on the way down. The second consequence is domestic American politics. Once it becomes visible that maximal rhetoric does not automatically generate maximal compliance, constituencies inside the United States change their behavior. Business groups become more vocal earlier. Lawmakers from affected regions start demanding off-ramps sooner. Policy professionals become more cautious in promising outcomes publicly. The internal system starts pricing in embarrassment risk. That reduces tactical freedom for future confrontations. The third consequence is for markets. Markets are not patriotic about leveraged narratives. They care whether the machinery works. If they conclude that trade threats are now more inflationary, more politically reversible, and less operationally clean than advertised, they begin discounting future escalation scenarios differently. Some sectors may rally not because they think the conflict is over, but because they think enforcement credibility has been weakened. Others may still suffer because uncertainty itself is costly. That divergence tells you the market is no longer trading the story as a simple domination script. The fourth consequence is institutional. Bureaucracies learn from humiliation even when politicians avoid admitting it. Agencies start drafting fallback options sooner. Trade desks start mapping allied retaliation more carefully. Central economic ministries start modeling domestic political blowback more aggressively. In plain English, the machine becomes more aware of its own limits. That can improve policy later, but in the short term it is an admission that the old assumptions broke down. The fifth consequence is allied perception. If you are another U.S. partner watching this unfold, the lesson is not that America is powerless. The lesson is that American pressure works best against governments that are either underprepared, divided, or overly dependent on immediate access. Preparation narrows the gap. Coordination narrows the gap. A credible domestic message narrows the gap. The more governments internalize that, the more Washington must rely on coalition building and less on deadline theater. The sixth consequence is strategic culture. A political system that grows too accustomed to the image of power can become less disciplined about the cost of using power. That is one of the most dangerous drifts any large country can experience, because once you start performing leverage instead of measuring it, you eventually issue a threat that the other side can survive, and that survival becomes a public demonstration of your miscalculation. Repairing that takes longer than people think. The seventh consequence is personal for viewers, and this one matters. If you are in your 40s, 50s, or 60s and trying to protect retirement capital, this kind of policy conflict is not background noise. It changes corporate planning. It changes margins. It changes inflation assumptions. It changes how often businesses are forced to hold extra inventory, hedge more aggressively, postpone projects, or absorb unexpected compliance expense. All of those changes affect valuations, dividends, wages, and fixed income reality. People hear trade conflict and think geopolitics. Buffett hears trade conflict and thinks hidden tax, and he is usually right, because that is what a badly managed trade fight becomes, a hidden tax on everyone who is not in the room. There is also a deeper consequence that policymakers almost never say out loud. Once an ally demonstrates it can survive your pressure better than you expected, your future threats become harder to calibrate. If you threaten too much, you risk another public test and another public constraint. If you threaten too little, you invite more resistance, so you enter a narrower corridor where every move must be more precise. Precision is good in theory. In practice, it is a confession that brute assumptions no longer work. This is where Canada's win, if we are going to call it that, should be described carefully. It was not a total win. It did not erase structural dependence. It did not transform geography. It did not make the American market irrelevant. Anyone claiming that is doing fantasy, not analysis. The win was subtler and in some ways more important. Canada proved that dependence is not the same thing as helplessness. It proved that preparation can raise the cost of coercion. It proved that a smaller partner can force a larger one to experience the difference between making a threat and monetizing it. That difference changes negotiations going forward. And that is why I keep coming back to the phrase information advantage. Because the most valuable thing Carney's government seemed to possess was not rhetorical courage by itself. It was a better estimate of where the real pain thresholds were on both sides. If you know those thresholds more accurately than your counterpart, you can remain calm when they are still trying to frighten you with numbers you have already stress tested. That kind of calm is not stylistic, it is computational. There is a specific kind of confidence that only comes from knowing the opposing side is about to discover costs it is not fully priced in. It is not loud, it is not cinematic, it does not need theatrical gestures, it just needs discipline. That is the confidence this refusal projected, and that is why the aftermath mattered more than the moment itself, because the moment was a headline. The aftermath was a verdict. Keep an eye on what businesses do next, not what politicians say next. Watch procurement language. Watch capital expenditure guidance. Watch whether affected sectors behave as if the threat remains decisive, or as if they have begun planning around its limits. Watch whether Washington returns with sharper tools or softer words. Watch whether Ottawa continues projecting procedural calm instead of emotional escalation. Those indicators will tell you whether the lesson was temporary or permanent. Keep an eye, too, on the narrative shift inside the United States. If the conversation moves from punishment to coordination, from deadlines to dialogue, from force to framework, then you already know what happened, even if nobody on television wants to say it plainly. You know the pressure met resistance and found out the resistance had been capitalized. And that is the final point. Carney rejected the deadline. Washington expected the refusal to create Canadian vulnerability. Instead, the refusal created American revelation. It revealed that urgency is not the same thing as leverage. It revealed that size is not the same thing as freedom of action. It revealed that a prepared partner can survive the first shock long enough to make the larger side pay for its own theatrics. That is not a small diplomatic embarrassment. That is a structural warning. For Ottawa, the lesson is that preparation buys sovereignty. For Washington, the lesson is that leverage which cannot be used cleanly is already depreciating. For investors, the lesson is that political strength must always be translated into cost-bearing capacity before you trust it. And for everyone watching, their retirement account, grocery bill, and future purchasing power get squeezed by conflicts they never voted to underwrite, the lesson is even simpler. When governments play trade games badly, the public pays compound interest on the mistake. The deadline lasted a news cycle. The repricing of credibility will last much longer. That is the real story. If you want, I can now do one of these next.